Jim Collins at the Carnegie Endowment. You've described the protest movement as having forced a certain degree of opening up of the political process, potentially, electing governors and so on and so forth. Can you give me any sense for to what extent those leading the protests or those who hope for change are actually organizing to take any advantage of that? In other words, are we seeing new parties emerge? Are people beginning to work to organize campaigns to win a governorship? In my experience, that was always the weak point, but I'd like your opinion.
Jim, it's a very good question. I fully agree, and my prediction is there are two outcomes. One is Putin announces parliamentary elections in a year or in 2 years. That will create a natural platform for protesters to build new parties, register new parties. And I think this protest movement will split into several parties. Say, nationalistic party, left party, right, well, liberal party, maybe 5 liberal parties. And liberals always like many parties. But at least there will be a debate and a platform, because as you rightly said, right now, if you ask protesters, what happens if Putin somehow resigns? What would be your economic policy? What would be your social policy? What would be your foreign policy? And you'll have 10 different answers, right? And that's okay to have different opinions, but we want to have parties, platforms being shaped and in some sense personalized. And that process will happen if Putin announces extraordinary parliamentary elections in a year or two. I think that will happen. There are many people who believe it's not going to happen, but we'll see. There is an alternative scenario. Suppose it doesn't happen. Then there is an obvious thing for opposition to do, to run an alternative election or a primaries without an official election. So the opposition can actually run an election online with signing in electronic signatures from voters, and actually have a primaries, both parliamentary and presidential. So it'll be, say, 10 or 20 million people or 5 million people, we don't know how many, who would participate in such an election. And we'll see that, say, left-wing party gets 3 million votes, liberal party gets 2 million votes, and then we see that say, Mr. Navalny becomes the presidential candidate. That will have no formal legitimacy whatsoever, but it will have real legitimacy, because these elections will be run in a fair way. That will require some funds, but opposition is richer than we thought. Middle class is outraged and will donate some money. So I think this scenario is completely feasible. Nobody's talking about this scenario so far, but I think it's a natural way to maintain momentum. Because, as I said, protesters lack a cause, and that will be an easy cause. So there will be a reason to continue debate, continue discussion about future of Russia. So that would be another cause to do. But I would think that it will still be accompanied by general protests every month, I think, or every couple of weeks about honest elections.
Sergei, I'm sure you know there's something somewhat similar going on here in the United States now. The Americans Elect movement is doing an online convention to nominate an alternative slate for our presidential election. So it's more directly engaged, but it's using the same techniques that you suggest. So depending how they come out here, they'll probably be ready to export their technology.
The Russian protesters include a lot of people in the middle class who are IT entrepreneurs and who are already working on that.
They know all about it.
And the leading Russian opposition blogger, Mr. Navalny, has been very successful in retail fundraising over internet. So I think that is quite possible to happen. And unlike the US, where you also have alternative system of nominating and electing officials, in Russia, that would be considered to be the honest channel.
Dieter?
Thank you. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Question is, how serious do you think electoral fraud is? I mean, it was a real issue in December. Then Putin tried to preempt the issue by putting in web cameras and all that. The only story I heard was that there were some suspicious trucks in Leningrad, in Petersburg, Petersburg, I believe. And that's an old trick, of course, to use the soldiers and the military to make up for maybe missing votes in certain districts. Can you tell us a little more about that? Is it a serious issue, or is this going to be taken care of? Thank you.
It's a very serious issue, and if you read Twitter or Facebook, you see thousands of violations. The suspicious trucks were in thousands of electoral stations, and these trucks would vote in one station, go to another one, to another one, and to another one. And this is what webcams could not prevent, right? Webcams can count how many people came to the ballot box, and then you can compare that to the number of ballots you find in the ballot box. So some people came with 10 ballots. That is something you can discover, and actually it was discovered in some cases too. Also, webcams by law were installed also to monitor the process of counting the ballots after the voting is done. That didn't happen in all stations. But what webcams cannot do, they cannot really monitor the process you just mentioned. So the same person votes in this station, in that station, in that station. That is illegal. This is a criminal offense in Russia. And yet it happened. And there is now evidence of that. And that is what webcams cannot do. And I think we will know in the next few days how big that was. And one mathematical, well, statistical, but not legally binding method is actually to build a curve of the relationship between turnout and outcomes. And for all candidates, there is a bell-shaped curve, normal distribution. For Putin, of course, it's just a linear, increasing linear shape. And that's been the case for United Russia as well. And that kind of gives an opportunity to estimate the abnormal part of voting. And that's something that will be done already this week, and I will not be surprised if we see the numbers like 15% or something. So we are talking huge numbers. And some people would say that wouldn't change the outcome of the election. And I think, judging by the level of manipulation, it looks like the government wasn't really sure about that. The government didn't have to have a second round, a runoff, probably because they weren't sure about runoff as well. So I think the level of manipulation, these suspicious trucks in every city, even in Moscow, where every station has observers, some of these observers were kicked out, some of these observers were not allowed to do what they were supposed to do. So we are now talking about something like 4,000 violations. That's a lot of violations. We still have something like 100% turnout and 100% Putin votes in Chechnya. And Chechnya did not report numbers for something like 10 hours later. So we are talking about massive, massive fraud, which if we think Putin is popular, Putin would not need. So I think this is beyond anybody's expectation. And that will reinforce protest movement, of course. And a lot of people in the street just don't believe Putin is a legitimate president. As far as I know, by the way, Mr. Obama has not congratulated Mr. Putin so far as well. Yeah, so he's not sure about that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for excellent presentation. My name is Yana Peterson. I'm faculty at the University of California. I'm visiting Georgetown and Johns Hopkins. So you presented us with a very optimistic picture of foreign direct investments developments. And I was wondering if your assessment applies to all sectors, because I'd like you to comment on the developments in the banking sector. We all know that after 1998 Russian financial crisis, many private banks were nationalized, and currently the banking system is dominated by state-owned banks. And we know that the presence of foreign banks in the Russian banking sector is very limited, and there are quite few restrictions on foreign bank entry. And I was wondering, what do you think are the implications of the current ownership structure for the financial stability of the Russian banking sector? And what are your expectations with regards to the abolition of restrictions or developments of foreign direct investments in the banking sector?
Thank you. It's a very good question. First of all, let me say that there is a sector where foreign investors were badly treated, but also Russian private investors as well. This is electricity sector. When Russia privatized generation capacity in electricity, these Russian investors and foreign investors paid a lot of money, and then Russia walked away from its commitments to liberalize the market. And actually, about a year ago, we had a meeting with Mr. Putin, and I said there are a few things that Russian government didn't deliver on its promise: corruption, inflation, and this. And he said, corruption, don't worry, there'll be zero corruption in Russia. He didn't say when. On inflation, he said, we promised 7% this year, we will deliver, and he delivered, or central bank delivered. And on electricity, he said, you should understand, we cannot really deliver on this. He said, we just cannot afford letting market determine prices in the electricity market. And that, of course, was a direct blow to foreign and Russian investors in this particular industry. So I'm not optimistic about that sector. But coming back to foreign banking, here I think there is no issue of restrictions. Restrictions exist, but they are not binding. They're just not binding. This is a simple matter of fact. And a lot of foreign banks quit. It's not an issue of foreign banks unable to come. It's an issue of foreign banks unable to stay. Some of that is driven by the need to recapitalize their home operations in Europe. Some foreign banks have to sell to make sure they exist. And some banks just cannot compete in Russia. And the reason for that, as you rightly said, state banks. Now I have to disclose I'm a board member of Sberbank. And I think Sberbank has done very well in recent years, increasing efficiency. That is actually true. That's been a major effort to overhaul the bank. The bank is run much, much better, much more efficient. But of course, it's also a monopoly, in the sense that in many, many small towns and distant regions, the Sberbank controls the vast majority of retail market. And so it pays very little on deposits to its depositors, and so it pretty much has a huge margin. It's very hard to compete with Sberbank. It used to be easier, but now when Sberbank is much more efficient, it's very hard. And that's why some banks actually quit. Some foreign banks quit. It's not an issue. It's not an issue of restrictions. Now, what's going to happen? Well, Mr. Medvedev last June said Russia will privatize everything. And if you read his speech, you really see that in banks, Russia will privatize everything. So Sberbank will be 100% private. Since then, Sberbank postponed even a privatization of a minority stake. So the government responded to Mr. Medvedev, still President Medvedev, that privatization will happen sometime until 2017, which in Russian terms probably means we don't know when. And in that sense, I think this is a very uncertain scenario. But once Sberbank is private, I think it will be much easier to regulate it. And as a board member, I'm unhappy about that. But there is also a project, which I think is a very important project, to build a postal bank in Russia. So Sberbank has 20,000 branches. Russian Post has 40,000 branches. And if there is a private bank, foreign or Russian, or there is a joint venture of a Russian private and foreign bank to build a postal bank, that will be a major competitor to Sberbank. And still, I should say that once European banks and American banks are feeling better at home, there are still huge opportunities in Russia in niches that Sberbank still cannot cover. I think that is clear that Russian financial market will grow, because Russia is still very much underbanked. There are many services that don't exist. So I think a lot of foreign banks will come back. But it's not an issue of regulation or
Sergei, when I think about the examples of Japan, China, India, and a few others, I have to say it's a breathtaking proposal to create a postal bank to increase competitive pressure and reduce monopoly.
But they don't have Sberbank. They don't have Sberbank.
Well, maybe in Russia it will work. John.
Thanks. John Lipsky from the Nietzsche School for Advanced International Studies. You mentioned two things at the outset that were surprises. One, that your book had mentioned that your book had anticipated declining oil prices and therefore fiscal pressures in Russia. And in fact, and you also described a very good macroeconomic situation for the last few years. Obviously, high oil prices was the major contributor to that. But also, it's widely viewed that Alexei Kudrin was a positive force for restraining the pressures for ever-increasing fiscal spending. That it could have been fiscal policy could have been much less balanced than it was, or much less disciplined than it was.
Say it again. Which was a restraint? What was a restraint?
Kudrin, the
Minister
finance
Kudrin.
Alexei Kudrin.
Alexei Kudrin. Okay. Yeah.
He quit, as you know, flamboyantly. So question one, is that a fair representation of that there were great pressures for much more expansionary fiscal policy that were resisted? And more importantly, given that oil prices are very high now and are likely to stay high for the near future, is the new Putin government going to restrain fiscal spending and maintain discipline or lose control?
John, thank you very much. It's a very good question, and in short, I should say yes. Mr. Kudrin was a very important force restraining spending, and when he's gone, everybody's worried about this very issue. And he combined three qualities which are very rare in Russia. He was, and still is, a friend of Mr. Putin, who could actually stand up to Mr. Putin and say, I think you're making this or that mistake. There are very few people in Russia who can do that. Second, he's smart and professional. He knows what he's talking about. And third, he has a backbone. So he wants to do things he believes in. He's much less flexible or opportunistic, whatever word you want to use. And when you think about these three qualities, they're very hard to find in one single person in Russia. And I don't know who is going to replace him now. There is an interim replacement who is not a friend of Mr. Putin. So effectively, I think what's going on now is when the current finance minister needs to talk to Mr. Putin, he would ask Mr. Kudrin to do something. But that cannot last forever. And in that sense, I think everybody's worried about fiscal situation. But also, Mr. Kudrin has managed to build a consensus in the economic policy making and think tank community, and in the Ministry of Finance itself. So I think currently, at least in the interim stage, there is a debate that Russia needs budget rules, fiscal rules, that would indeed link spending to oil price, or actually delink spending from oil price. So far we see that President Medvedev is in favor of that. But to what extent it would be Mr. Putin or Mr. Medvedev who will be in charge of fiscal policy, we don't know. And I also think that so far Mr. Putin has been functioning as a person who believes that most political problems can be resolved by more spending. And so in that sense, everybody is very worried about higher spending. So with Mr. Kudrin gone from the government, I think everybody is asking the very same question you did.
Anders?
Yeah, can I follow up on this? There are two personalities that are discussed now, in particular outside of the government. One is Kudrin, for the reasons John mentioned, and the other person is Mikhail Prokhorov. After all, he stood in the election,
Prime Minister,
and he came now with 9% of the vote, and he is the person that the old liberal position, Parnas and so forth, are turning to. And of course, people are now asking, is he likely to be the prime minister after Medvedev has been there for a short period? will Putin be prepared to integrate Prokhorov into the political process? What do you think about that? And also a bit more broad terms, what do you think will happen to the government? There seems to be a total uncertainty about what kind of government there will be now. What are your thoughts?
I think that there is an uncertainty, and only Mr. Putin knows who's going to be in the government. I think that Mr. Medvedev will be appointed prime minister. How long he's going to last, I don't know. But he's definitely going to be appointed prime minister, and that's as much as we know. I think, and that also is something that, as I said, can positively surprise the markets. I think now markets price in reshuffling, but no real change in the government. So people moving from the presidential administration to the cabinet of ministers, and people moving from cabinet of ministers to presidential administration. That's what the market prices in. And I think if there are new strong faces, then I think market will be positively surprised. Mr. Prokhorov will only be a prime minister if there is a coalition government, in the sense that the prime minister will be independent of the president. And I think so far Mr. Putin is not prepared to do that, but that may change.
So you see it as an option?
He said, no way I will be a dependent prime minister. He publicly said that a few times. And Mr. Prokhorov is a person who values he delivers on what he says, which is costly, but also singles him out as one of the few people who are known for that, as well as actually Mr. Kudrin, who just said that he doesn't want to be a prime minister. But things may change.
Okay, further questions? Two back there. Finley and then Dick.
This is a little bit speculative.
Please identify.
Finley Lewis, CQ, Congressional Quarterly. This is a little bit speculative, but it's unlikely that Congress will eliminate Jackson Vanik in isolation. That is that I think there's enough nervousness on the Hill about being seen as doing a favor for Putin, that they're going to want some kind of political cover. And what you hear talked about up there is a bill introduced by Cardin and Congressman McGovern called the Accountability for Sergei Magnitsky Act. You're smiling. I think you know what's coming. What would that do? What would the impact of that be in Russia? How would Russia react to that? So that on the one hand, Jackson Vanik is eliminated from the books. On the other hand, there's something which is much more in the present tense, which would impose sanctions on anybody who had their fingerprints, for example, on Magnitsky's death. What would the impact of that be?
That's a very good question, and I think it's very clear how Russia considers the Magnitsky Act. And I think by observing what has happened to the Magnitsky case after his death, we can certainly say that the top political leadership doesn't want to prosecute people who have, as you said, fingerprints on the Magnitsky case. And apparently that started a long time before death of Magnitsky, when Bill Browder was denied his visa. Apparently that decision was taken very high up. And from public statements of Mr. Kudrin, we know that he went to Mr. Putin asking him to give visa to Bill Browder, and that didn't work. That means that some very high-ranking officials didn't like Mr. Browder, and further on had something to do with Mr. Magnitsky. That is an issue which is much less personal for Putin than Khodorkovsky's case. But Magnitsky's affair was an affair where Medvedev ordered an investigation and nothing happened. And I think that suggests that people who are involved somehow are connected to some very high up, the people who are very high up. And these people are extremely nervous about Magnitsky Act. So if you think about Magnitsky Act and Jackson Vanik, or status quo, we don't care about Jackson Vanik anymore. I think I think a lot of people hate the idea that there will be a Magnitsky Act, and people will hate the idea that this will also be done in Europe, because it hits corrupt officials at the very core of their model, of their world. If they are not able to travel, if they are not able to access their foreign accounts, then why take bribes? So I think this is something that Russian government is very unhappy about, and they will do whatever it takes to prevent that from happening, and they will retaliate. So whoever puts Mr. Boot in jail will not be able to access their accounts in Sberbank and travel to Russia.
Yeah, I'm Dick Smith, a former Foreign Service officer. I want to ask a question about a longer-term systemic problem that Russia faces. Russia, like much of the developed world, including Europe, is facing declining fertility rates, a lowering of the lifespan, and it seems to me that, like many other countries, but perhaps to a greater degree, they're going to require increased immigration over what they had before and an ability to integrate immigrants into their economy. And I'm wondering if people, policymakers in Russia, are aware of this problem and are thinking about it, and if anything's happening that might respond to it.
Dick, this is a very important question. There are a number of issues in that question. One is fiscal, the pension system, which I think has to be addressed as a fiscal issue. And so far it's not been addressed, and the government said we will not raise retirement age. And now I think that everybody knows that we will have to raise the retirement age, otherwise the current pensioners will not be paid. So now there is a search of wording that will be consistent with previous statements by Putin. We will not raise retirement age, and yet this wording will be consistent with raising retirement age. So I think there is now a search for a model to reform the fiscal system. On the life expectancy in general, so part of the problem with Russian demographics is low life expectancy of males. So Russian women live as long as women in similar countries. Russian men just 3 years ago lived 10 years shorter. Now this gap has decreased, and it will decrease further because much of this gap is due to binge drinking and smoking. And Russian government needs cash, and Russian government will tax alcohol and tobacco. I'm actually very happy to talk about that because we as a New Economist School did a lot of research on these issues, measuring elasticities, measuring fiscal implications, but also we measured the political support for raising tobacco prices. Putin's problem was he didn't want to offend yet another part of Russian society. He thought there would be protests against high alcohol and high tobacco prices. Some people would say that people who control vodka business in Russia are close friends of Putin, but I think that is something that is probably not clear whether it matters in his decision making or not. But we did research, and it looks like even smokers support higher prices because they want to quit. And in that sense, I think male life expectancy will go up. That will create further fiscal problems because then male will claim their pensions. Males will claim their pensions. But then the immigration issue, you're right on target. This is extremely painful. Russia is not a tolerant society. We did research on how many immigrants would move to Russia and whether it's going to be enough. And our estimates are that if Russia doesn't have draconian immigration laws, then, and I think that's a baseline scenario because business needs people. So our estimates are that Russian population bottoms out in 2020 or 2025 and starts growing. And but then Russia will be an immigrants country like Canada or Australia with 20% of foreign-born population. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be very painful. And right now in the opposition, there is a substantial part of opposition that hates that happening. And I think it will be a major political issue in the coming 10 or 20 years. right now this debate is burdened by corruption, because what happens, a lot of immigrants are exploited by corrupt cops, by corrupt policemen, and they bribe their way through. And so once corruption is eliminated, that will be much easier to deal with. Currently, it's very hard to separate corruption issue and ethnic nationalism, but it's going to be very difficult. I think it's one of the, as you rightly said, one of the major long-term challenges. But government doesn't do much about that.
Scott?
Thank you for the very insightful presentation. My name is Scott Miller. I'm with Procter & Gamble. We obviously have a big, pretty successful operation in Russia. We have about 4,000 Russian employees. But part of our success is being an American company and having Western or American brands for sale. Let me ask a deeper question that's on my mind about the anti-American rhetoric. First, is it believed by the Russian public? And second, do you think that might have any effect on American companies doing business in Russia in terms of how they're perceived, how their products are perceived?
Scott, I think you've answered this question when asking the question. When you choose between American brand and Russian brand, generally Russians would prefer an American brand.
Yeah.
I think there is a general understanding that American companies are not corrupt, or at least much less corrupt than Russian companies. Usually it's believed that people who work in American companies are less corrupt, and these people are also better trained. So if you ask a government official whether he wants his kids to work in Sberbank or Goldman Sachs, there is no doubt Goldman Sachs is better, with all the conspiracy theories. I think there is no question about that. So I think that is very clear. If you, for example, you buy a life insurance policy, with all the problems with AIG in recent years, I think, again, there is no question that you'd probably buy a life insurance policy from an American life insurance company. If you think about healthcare, Russian government officials are very patriotic, but they go to Swiss hospitals, Israeli hospitals, or American hospitals. And there is an operation owned by Russians in Moscow called European Medical Center. It has French doctors, but it's owned by Russians. And the very word European Medical Center actually is very important to its success. So I think at the personal level, Russians would rather drive American cars than Russian cars. But don't fund the opposition. Once you start funding the opposition, I think that will be a problem. But you can fund the universities.
New Economic School in particular.
My name is Carol Colleen with Eurasia Group, and just a follow-up question on Prokhorov. If you could maybe just talk a little bit about what you think his future political career might look like. He's announced that he wants to form a political party. He had an unprecedented showing, especially given that he didn't have a political infrastructure in place and the overall negative Russian views toward oligarchs. So it seems like he could have really been one of the clear winners of this election. So do you see a political future for him? And to what extent will he be able to capture part of the protest movement in that vote going forward? Thanks.
Thank you. We don't really know. I spent quite a bit of time talking to Prokhorov about his policies, policy positions, and about his personal plans, and I still don't know. And I think for him, I think he kind of believes that he cannot really achieve more in business than he's achieved already. And so he's looking for a new career, and that looks like an obvious career. I think he underestimates the baggage from 1990s. But he is a very reasonable and smart person, so he knows that this baggage is costly to him. His economic program makes sense. His political program is actually very, very reasonable and very anti-Putin, I should say. He refrains from making personal anti-Putin statements. He won so many votes this time, and he knows that, because the choice was so limited. So all the middle class couldn't really vote for anybody else but for him. And I think if the votes were not stolen, he would probably walk away with 15% of the vote. And he actually carried Moscow as a second. In many poll stations, he actually beat Putin in Moscow. So we don't know what the honest campaign outcome would be. But even with this counting, he is second in Moscow, second in St. Petersburg, second in Yekaterinburg. So I think if there is an honest campaign, Mr. Navalny would beat Mr. Prokhorov, provided they have the same funding, which is, of course, a problem for Mr. Navalny. I think Mr. Prokhorov and Mr. Kudrin want to create a party each. They want to create a party. Each of them will create a party with exactly the same platform. So it will make sense for them to merge. I don't think they will merge, but I think Prokhorov's achievement in this campaign suggests that he is a much more viable political person than Mr. Kudrin. So I can only praise his achievement. And I think he's also grown a lot. If you look at his performance just a few months ago, and for example, 2 days ago after the election, he's a very conscious, confident politician who knows what he's doing, who knows how to speak. That is completely different from just 7 months ago. And I think he's also gained a lot of credibility by the fact that he stepped down from that political party in summer, or he was kicked out over a simple case of one candidate from Yekaterinburg. He came to that candidate and he said, I like what you're doing. That candidate has a controversial biography, but he's doing a great thing on fighting drug users, or fighting drug pushers and rehabilitating drug users. So Prokhorov came to that guy and said, join my party. And that guy said, I will join your party, but you will be forced to drop me. And that was true. Mr. Prokhorov was told, either you drop this guy or we'll kick you out. And Mr. Prokhorov said, I will keep this guy. And he was kicked out. And I think that adds to credibility because this is a very scarce commodity. Like Mr. Kudrin stepped down over a principal issue, of the issue of policy he believes in. Mr. Prokhorov was kicked out over a principle as well. And I think that makes them very few people who can actually be credible politicians in Russia.
I'll give you an insight on Prokhorov's future in Russian politics.
Okay.
It depends on whether his New Jersey Nets are able to hire Dwight Howard away from Orlando, give them a chance at the NBA championship, in which case he might divert more of his attention in this direction. With that levity, let me thank you, Sergei, once again. It was terrific. Thanks to all of you for coming. We're going to keep tuned to all of these debates. Thank you.